I've been with the ACEN since 2012 as a full-time staff member, but I've been a peer evaluator since 2004. And so I've been around the block a few times, but I love accreditation and I love working with individuals. And I'm looking forward to this opportunity with each of you. So one of the things that we're going to do today, because my understanding is that as far as the programs participating, we have a mixture of currently accredited ACEN programs as well as some programs who are beginning the accreditation process with the ACEN. And so what we're going to be talking about are the 4 steps of the evaluation process, and this applies both to programs seeking initial accreditation as well as continuing accreditation. We're going to talk a little bit about how to prepare for that accreditation visit, and then also some of the resources that are available to you from the ACEN. And one of the things I want to emphasize to everyone, never hesitate to pick up the phone and call the ACEN. One of your biggest resources are the ACEN directors. All 4 of the directors, which is myself, Carrie Nunn Ellison, Suzette Farmer, Sharon Beasley, are former nurse educators, although I like to consider myself still a nurse educator. And from that perspective, we've walked in your shoes, and so we do understand what you're going through. And sometimes it helps us to have that sounding board. And my philosophy is, if you don't know the answer to the question, please ask the question. So never hesitate to pick up the phone. Typically, our primary contact is always the nurse administrator. However, we will respond to questions from faculty. We just request that you copy your nurse administrator. That way he or she is aware of the answers that we give. So one of the things let's talk about are the different steps of the actual evaluation process. As you know, accreditation in many states is an optional process. State of California is optional. And so for those of you who are pursuing that process, it's not something you have to do. That being said, in the United States currently, there's now 30 states that are requiring accreditation to some extent. With that requirement, sometimes it's at the associate degree and higher, and in other states it may be at the practical level as well. It is a self-assessment process, and the thing about nursing education in general is it's always important for internal reflection on our programs, what we're doing well, what we could improve upon, because that's how we're going to provide that quality program. So in essence, the first step of any evaluation process will be that self-study report. And so it's going to be important to understand how to write the self-study report. So we're going to spend a little bit of time on that today. The second step is the site visit itself, where some of your peers will come on site, or in the case of COVID, we're actually doing virtual accreditation visits. Then the ACEN, in comparison to some other nursing accrediting agencies, as well as other accreditors in general, have a third step to the process, which is also peer reviewed, and that's our evaluation review panel. And so today we're going to discuss a little more about the ERP. And then ultimately, the decision regarding your accreditation, be it an initial accreditation or a continuing accreditation, will be made by our Board of Commissioners. And we'll talk a little bit about the Board of Commissioners level. Let's talk about the self-study report. The thing about the self-study report is that this is your story. And that's what we like to talk about with regards to the self-study. The self-study is your story. And who better can tell your own story than the faculty who are currently working in a program? And one of the things I want to emphasize is the self-study report should be a faculty-driven process. It's not the responsibility of the nurse administrator to write the entire report and to present it as a work of the program. And why is it important that all faculty participate? Because during the actual visit itself, it's going to be extremely important that multiple individuals are aware of what that report actually says so that you can respond to the questions. And so the self-study report, the number one purpose of that report is to demonstrate your compliance with the standards and criteria. Many of you probably know we have 6 standards. Standard 1 has to do with mission and administrative capacity. Standard 2 has to do with faculty and staff. Standard 3 has to do with, I don't know why my PowerPoint keeps going forward, my apologies. Standard 3 has to do with students. Standard 4 has to do with curriculum. Standard 5 is resources. And Standard 6 is outcomes. Each of those standards has several criteria within the standard, and each of those has some specific components to it. The ACEN accredit nursing programs from the practical level up through the clinical doctorate level. So one of the key things that you have to make sure is that prior to starting your story and your own self-study report, make sure that you get the correct set of standards and criteria. Because if you're coming through with a practical program versus an associate degree program, there are some slight differences in some of the standards and the select criteria. There are definite differences from the baccalaureate, master's, and clinical doctorate perspective. And so you don't want to write the story from the wrong set of standards and criteria. There are many similarities, but there are some distinct differences. And so your self-study will be writing the program's compliance with the standards and criteria. It is going to provide a representation of your program. And so it's going to be important that this representation is clear, that it's complete as possible, but yet that it is concise. You only have 200 pages if you're submitting a self-study report for a single program to tell your whole story. And so while we like to tell a lot about ourselves, it will be important that you get the critical information in there, as I will refer to the need to know versus all the nice to know. Another thing that's going to be important is that you will provide your peers a brief program history. Typically, this will be done in an introduction section to the self-study report itself, and with that, how faculty participate in the self-evaluation process. One of the key things about writing the self-study report, think about it in some regards like your master's thesis or your PhD dissertation. It's not one of those reports that you can wait until the weekend before it's due to actually start writing it. We really suggest to our programs that you start this process about 2 years before the actual visit. Now, please don't panic if your visit's a little bit sooner than that and you haven't started the report. It definitely can be done in that time frame, but the longer you have to kind of work on the report and to refine the report, the more you can actually do some round robin so that different individuals are looking at it. So one of the first things that you want to do is determine some timelines. Your self-study report in its entirety would be due to your site visit team 6 weeks before your accreditation visit itself. And so if you have a visit coming up in fall of 2021, then now's the time to be writing that self-study report, because for a fall visit, your report would be due approximately August the 1st, somewhere between August the 1st and September the 15th, depending upon if your visit was at the beginning of the visit cycle versus at the end. And so you want to make sure that you have time to refine that report, to get it printed and get it ready. And so you would want to back your timelines up. And for some of our programs, perhaps all of the faculty are new to the process, even perhaps the nurse administrator is new to the process. And so please never hesitate to reach out to the ACEN directors should you have questions about how to even get started with this process. One of the things that you will find available to you on the ACEN website is a fairly new document. We've always had a document to help you write the self-study report, but the directors have worked on a new document that came out earlier this year called ACEN Guidelines for Written Report. Within this is information about each of the standards, each of the criteria. It provides you with what we call focus questions, which are questions that could be used for verifying that the content is there within each of the standards and select criteria. But those focus questions could also be used to practice responding to questions like a mock visit, where somebody would be asking questions of other folks. And so one of those, and then with those guidelines, we've been asked for it for a long time. and we finally did it. There is a template for the actual report itself that you can elect to use. And notice that I say you can elect to use it. The ACEN allows all of our programs to write their self-study report however you want to write it. And so you are not required to use the template that's in the guidelines. That being said, you certainly can, or you can look at that template and pick some of the things that you like about it and use those parts and leave off the stuff you don't like about it. Again, with regards to writing the self-study report, I always suggest that you divide and conquer. As faculty, one of the things, if you've never been through an accreditation visit, that you need to understand, at some point during that accreditation visit, your peers are going to meet with faculty one-on-one. There won't be any administrators in the room. It's just going to be the faculty and your peers. And so what's critical about that is during that meeting is that the faculty can speak to the various standards and criteria within that report. And one of the ways that this can happen is to make sure that you've divided and conquered. So this group of folks or these two individuals have worked on standard 1 so that when your peers ask questions about standard 1, they're ready to go. Somebody else can respond to questions on standard 2. And so it's not just one person constantly responding to those questions. Just think about your classroom skills with your students. If a student over here is constantly answering all the questions, what are you going to do during that classroom? You're going to try and say, well, Sally, thanks for answering that question, but let me hear from Ben over here. And so your peers will do the same thing. If one person seems to be the spokesperson, they're going to be asking additional questions of other folks. And so by dividing and conquering, it takes this big pie that you're going to have to develop and splits it into smaller pieces that are easier to respond to. Because the other important thing as you're writing the self-study report is you have to build your evidences, meaning that you have to have the supporting information upon which to base the story so that your peers have those same pieces of evidence to verify that the story is accurate. Also, what's real important is making sure that you have the support of not only internal stakeholders, but also external stakeholders. Sometimes administration at colleges, and I can say this because I've been in nursing education for 30 some odd years, and I've had to deal with presidents and faculty. Sometimes you got to get buy-in from everybody, especially when accreditation is not required in your state. And so, taking this report and writing it on top of your normal faculty workload does require some effort. And there may need to be an opportunity to advocate for a couple of folks, perhaps getting some specific release time to help get ready for the accreditation visit, or perhaps have an extra service agreement where they're working on some of this above and beyond what they're currently doing. And so it's really important for folks within the institution to understand what's going on and what you have to do in order to demonstrate your compliance with the standards and criteria. As I briefly alluded to, the length of the overall report for a single program, so if you're just an associate degree program writing your story, then you have 200 pages from front to back to actually tell that story. If you're coming through with two programs at the same time, for example, a practical and an associate degree program, you would have a total of 300 pages. Now, you may be sitting there going, well, wait a minute, if I've got to talk about two separate programs, why do I only have an extra 100 pages? Part of that is secondary to the fact, as I've alluded to, the standards and criterion are the same for multiple criterion throughout. And for example, standard 1, mission and administrative capacity. In order for two programs to come through at the same time, the same nurse administrator is overseeing both programs. Now, he or she may have additional folks to help them at the practical level versus the associate degree level, but ultimately one person's responsible. So what you will find in standard 1 is that typically all of the criteria apply to both programs. And so a single narrative that applies to both programs is what you would want to write in Standard 1. In Standard 2, faculty and staff, many of the criteria are the same. For example, how faculty are oriented, how faculty are evaluated, what professional development opportunities. You're all working for the same governing organization, so many of those components of Standard 2 are the same. Typically, the only four criterion that may differ are criterion 2.1, which has to do with your full-time faculty, criterion 2.2, which is your part-time faculty, 2.3, which is non-nurse faculty, which oftentimes is not applicable, and then 2.4, the potential use of preceptors. Those are the only four criterion in 2 that might differ between the programs. And I say might because many of you may actually be shared between the practical and the associate degree program. And so your full-time faculty, your load is shared, and so you're all full-time shared faculty. So Standard 2, in many cases, is very similar throughout all of the criterion for both programs. 3, which has to do with students, unless you have separate student handbooks, all of the criterion in 3 have more to do with the governing organization and the processes that apply to students, the services that apply to students. So oftentimes Standard 3 is exactly the same for both programs. Standard 5, which is resources. You're all in the same building, you're using the same labs, the same computers, the same classrooms, your offices are comparable. So Standard 5 is often the same for both programs. The 2 criteria that truly would need to be reflective of each program independent of the other is Standard 4 curriculum versus Standard 6 outcomes. And for Standard 4, sometimes you have a 1+1 curriculum. So if the first semester is your practical program where students are eligible to sit for the practical exam, but then semester 2 is your associate degree, then there are a lot of commonalities. But Standard 4 typically will need to be written specific to each of the programs. In Standard 6, your outcomes would need to be written to each specific program. So that's where the extra 100 pages come in, are specific to Standard 4 and 6, and potentially a little bit on Standard 2. The good news are the appendices. The appendices, the ACN has 3 required appendices. One is your faculty profile table, which the faculty profile table includes a cover sheet. We actually have a template on the ACN website that you're required to use for the faculty profile table. So you have a cover sheet that discusses the specifics of the requirements for the state nursing regulatory agency. So in your case, what the California Registered Nurse Board of Nursing requires, or the LVN Board of Nursing requires related to faculty. Number 2, what the institutional accrediting agency requires. So ACCJC, what requirements do they have for faculty, if any? They may not have specific requirements that apply, and so you would need to tell your peers that that's just not applicable. And then the governing organization itself. What do your job descriptions say is required of full-time faculty versus part-time faculty? That's the cover sheet for the faculty profile table. Then the faculty profile table, you have tables. And for those of you participating tomorrow, we're going to actually go over the faculty profile table in a little more detail because it's part of the candidacy presentation. But the tables would be for faculty that are full-time, that are exclusive to the program, teaching only in the associate degree program, which is coming through, versus exclusive part-time faculty. And then in some cases, you may have shared individuals that are shared between the practical and associate, or perhaps shared between nursing and another allied health or health careers, gen ed type, interdisciplinary type degree. And so it's just a table that provides some brief information about every individual currently teaching in the program. And then the third component of a faculty profile table is what we refer to as a qualification and professional development addenda. What the addenda really is a brief bio or CV about each of your faculty members. And the purpose of this is not to provide every CE that you've ever taken or necessarily every job that you've ever worked. It's really the opportunity to demonstrate how an individual is qualified to teach his or her assigned courses. From the perspective, and I'll use myself as an example, my master's degree is in family nursing, and the majority of my clinical experiences have been in maternal child and or women's health. But in my teaching career, I've actually had to do mental health clinicals. I've actually had to do critical care clinicals. And so how am I qualified with my background to actually fill those roles? Did I draw the short straw and I'm the one who has to do that? In the case, we don't require that faculty have formal education per se, but because there's many ways that I could gain expertise. And I can guarantee you before I went into that intensive care unit or supervised students, I did my own professional development prior to going into those areas. So what we see is that you can gain expertise through formal education, through your experiences. And, having worked at a small 75-bed hospital, you see everything coming through that small facility. And then thirdly, your professional development could be how you maintain it. So the qualification professional development addendum is real succinct to say, here's how Nell is qualified to currently be teaching this mental health course. And then the second required appendices related to Standard 4 is a 2-page abbreviated syllabi for each of the nursing courses or syllabus. In the guidelines for written report, they specify what needs to be included in this abbreviated syllabus. The abbreviated syllabi are used for Standard 2 to kind of help your peers to understand what Nursing 1, 2, 3 is all about, so that, again, I can verify that Nell is qualified to teach in Nursing 1, 2, 3. But your abbreviated syllabi are also used for the person running to Standard 4 to kind of give them a broad overview of the curriculum and how it flows together and how each course is tied to the end of program student learning outcomes, which is an important component of Standard 4. And then the final required appendices is your systematic plan of evaluation. Using the 2017 standards and criteria, programs should only be providing an SPE specific to Standard 6. Let me repeat that. Using the 2017 standards and criteria, the only systematic plan of evaluation is for Standard 6 and Standard 6 only. For some of you participating in today's workshop that are seeking continuing accreditation, you may remember 8 years ago when you had your last visit that you had to send in a plan for Standards 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. That is no longer required, and no longer should you submit a plan inclusive of all 6 standards, only Standard 6. Certainly, if you already have that systematic plan for the other standards and criteria, use it as an internal working document to keep up with where you are in having the evidence to support your compliance with those standards, but no longer are you sharing that information with your peers. It's going to be focused on Standard 6 and all 4 criterion in Standard 6, and so it's only Standard 6. The required appendices, the faculty profile table, the 2-page abbreviated syllabi, and the systematic evaluation plan do not count in the 200 or 300 pages. They should be part of your continuous pagination, but they don't count toward those 200 pages. So for some faculty, if with the cover sheet, the faculty tables, and the individual addendum, you may have a 50-page faculty profile table. Those 50 pages don't count toward the 200. So your whole document could be 250 pages. 2-page abbreviated syllabi. Well, we have 12 nursing courses, so that's 24 pages. Those 24 pages don't count toward the 200 pages. And then your systematic plan of evaluation specific to Standard 6 oftentimes will be a minimum of 4 pages, probably closer to 10, depending upon how many end-of-program student learning outcomes you have. So with the required appendices, it's easy to say that between the faculty profile table, the abbreviated syllabi, and the SPE, there could be an additional 50 to 100 pages. So your entire document is actually going to be 300 pages or perhaps 400 pages for multiple programs, but the required appendices don't count toward that maximum number. You can have optional appendices. And again, for those of you who are seeking continuing accreditation, in the old days, you had your appendices and you still had only the 200 pages. Well, the optional appendices, it is up to you as a faculty to determine what you want to include in your report versus what you want to provide as supporting evidence. And in just a second, in a minute, we're going to talk more about supporting evidence. But if you really want to include the nurse administrator CV as one of the appendices, then certainly you can do so, but any optional appendices do count as part of the 200 pages. Again, I keep referencing continuous pagination. One of the things that is critical about your self-study report is that from starting with page 1 all the way through the final page, which often is the last page of your systematic plan of evaluation as the final appendices, is that it's continuously paginated 1 through 300. And part of that is because your peers, as they're writing their site visit reports, will be referencing your self-study report. The evaluation review panel will be referencing your self-study report. And it's very challenging to do that when it's not paginated, to figure out where it stops and starts. And so please make sure that as you're working with some of your support staff and your clerical staff, that continuous pagination gets added to the report from that perspective. Again, as I've mentioned, there are the ACEN guidelines for written reports. It does include those focus questions, which can be used to help verify that the narrative of the report itself includes all of the information about the specifics for that particular criterion. Again, there also is a template specific that you can use if you choose to, but you are not required to. And then throughout the template, you will also note that there are several tables, especially tables related to curriculum, specific to credits and contact, number of clinical hours. These tables actually have come out of the site visit report that your peers will be using to write their report. And so if you want, use these tables within your self-study report because it provides the information in a very succinct manner for your peers to actually pull the information they need for their report. And on this, I have listed the website and links where all of this information can be found. It's not new because we've been doing it for over 2 years now, but some of you may not be aware, we do have also what's called an advisory review that programs can elect to have as part of their preparation for their continuing accreditation visit. An advisory review is where the program can elect for a very nominal fee to have a professional staff member review a standard of your choice and spend 4 hours with your faculty going over that review. An advisory review can also include information about the process because perhaps you haven't been able to get to a self-study forum and you've never been through an accreditation visit and you're just wanting some additional help from that perspective. Perhaps you're needing some assistance with your systematic plan of evaluation and different things like that. And so for, as I mentioned, a very nominal fee, the professional staff will review whatever you're wanting us to review based upon the fee schedule and then spend 4 hours of review with your faculty on a webinar actually going over that. Part of the rationale for the advisory review and what we've done with this is that unfortunately, we had a lot of programs who were using consultants from the outside to unfortunately put themselves forward as being ACEN experts, and yet they perhaps had no relationship, no previous relationship whatsoever with our organization. And even though these programs paid a lot of money for these individuals, they led them down the wrong rabbit trail. And so the advisory review was put into place because we, as a professional staff, recognized that for some of our continuing accreditation programs, they were using these expensive consultants and not necessarily getting good information. And so, again, for a very nominal fee, you can actually have one of the ACEN directors review parts of your self-study report. Now, for my programs coming through candidacy, part of our candidacy process allows you to submit one standard of your choice to the ACEN for one of the professional staff members to actually review it. I review many of those, but sometimes when we have a whole bunch of candidates coming through, I will share those with my colleagues. And so we will actually review a standard of your choice from the full self-study report, and that's part of the candidacy fee that you've already paid, and so there is no additional fee. Now, that is one standard. I have had programs who wanted more standards reviewed, and so for those, they got the one standard as part of the candidacy, but they did sign up for an advisory review above and beyond. Again, you do not have to sign up for advisory reviews. It is an optional service that is available to you as an ACEN accredited program or as a program that's seeking accreditation with our organization. And there is more information on the website about that. Step 2 of the process is the actual site visit. Again, the site visit is conducted by peer evaluators from the same program types. And so if you're having an associate degree visit, your site visitors will be primarily from associate degree programs. We like to have clinicians on our teams. And so there may be one individual on the team that is truly a nurse who's working in the field, and he or she is participating as that clinician. But typically, at least 2 of the folks on your team are truly associate degree folks. For individuals having visits with more than one program, we will have a mixture of individuals. The site visit team may have 4 people, and 1 or 2 are experts in practical nursing and 1 or 2 are experts in associate degree, or oftentimes we're using our AP folks who are coming from programs who have both an associate and a practical program. The purpose of the site visit team is to come and to conduct an independent analysis and make professional judgments of your program's compliance with the standards and criteria. And then their findings are documented in a site visit report. The site visit cycles are in the fall. We typically begin the 3rd week of September, so it's the last 2 weeks of September, the month of October, and if needed, we bleed into November. So it's typically 6 weeks, and we can do anywhere. Our lowest cycle has been about 80 programs, and we have done as many as 120 programs in a cycle. Because one of the things that the ACEN is committed to is that if we have programs ready to move forward, we will do the accreditation visit. For those of you with a continuing visit, you actually do have to send us an invitation to come and do your reaccreditation visit. Our spring cycle is the last couple of weeks of January, the month of February, and the first 1 to 2 weeks in March. And so nurse administrators that are on the phone for continuing accreditation, historically you do receive a reminder 18 months before the cycle to submit what's called your information form, requesting a visit for the cycle in which your reaccreditation visit should occur. If you're new to your position and you're not sure when your next reaccreditation visit is, you can look on the ACEN website and it will tell you that information when you look up your program. But again, if you're not sure, please don't hesitate to reach out and contact one of the ACEN directors, and we'll be happy to walk you through that process. You'll also find on our website lots of resources available to you as nurse administrators to help you get ready for the site visit. For those of you seeking initial accreditation, you get to pick when you're ready to come through for an initial visit. Once you've achieved a candidate status, and again, we'll go over more of this tomorrow, you would have up to 2 years to schedule that initial visit. And many of my programs, if they're ready to go, they'll schedule it in the very next accreditation cycle that's available. Or there are some times where programs will wait and schedule it in the very last cycle. And in a minute, when we talk about decisions that can be made, they'll kind of make more sense why you might want to delay. With initial accreditation visits, the deadline for applying for a fall visit, regardless of the year, is always March the 1st. And so you would have to have a candidate status prior to March 1 in order to have a fall visit of the same year. So it is still possible for some of you who are coming through accreditation, if you submit your candidacy presentation and achieve a candidate status by March 1st of 2021, you could be hosting an initial accreditation visit in fall of 2021 should you choose to. The application deadline for initials for a spring visit is always July the 1st. And so again, you have to achieve a candidate status prior to July the 1st. But again, for those seeking continuing accreditation, nurse administrators are reminded to get their information form in for that visit 18 months prior to the actual cycle itself. What's the purpose of the site visit team? Their number one purpose is to verify. They are there to verify what you've written in your self-study report is exactly what's happening at the program. This verification process is done through looking at the documents that you've collected to help in that verification process. The verification is also done through interviews with different individuals. And so what I want to say to everyone is it's helpful to your peers that when you write your self-study report, your story, that your story is so clear that your peers understand what it's saying, that it's so inclusive that they're not having to look for additional information. Because it's so much easier when you go on an accreditation visit for you basically to be able to check the boxes. Yep, that's what they're doing. Yep, that's what they're doing. Versus getting there and having to help tell the story. Because the second role that they have is clarifying. Oftentimes when we write our own stories, sometimes it's difficult for us to see the trees for the forest that we're in. And so it's perfectly clear to us because we're eating and living and breathing that story on a day in and day out basis. But as a pair of outside eyes, as a pair of eyes that has never been to California or visited a California program, they may not understand the things that are second nature to you. And so their second role is if something is not clear to them in your self-study report, that they ask clarifying questions. And again, what I encourage programs is to try to minimize how much needs to be clarified, because then the role of the site visitors is to amplify that information. And what we mean by amplifying is if you did not tell your story effectively, then your peers in their site visit report need to add that additional information so that the next two levels of review, the evaluation review panel, and ultimately our board of commissioners who will be making that final decision, has that information upon which to base their decision. And think about it this way. The more that your peers have to clarify and amplify, the higher potential there is they don't have enough time to get it all done. because a site visit is really 2 full days. And that's a lot of information to cover in 2 full days. Now, there's a lot of prep ahead of time, but 2 days to get and clarify and amplify someone's story who's not done a thorough job of it is very challenging for your peers. The purpose of the site visit team is not to terrify you. And I know that there have been individuals who've had some, pardon me, have had some previous accreditation experiences that were less than optimal. Pardon me. Again, these are your peers. They are there to verify your compliance with the standards and criteria. And one of the things that ACEN is adamant about is if you happen to have a bad experience with your next accreditation visit, we want to know about it, because your peers should be collegial. They really should be looking at verifying your compliance and asking questions. Now, sometimes, I'll be honest, in that verification process, you're sitting there going, well, wait a minute, that is on page such and such. I know it's there. Why are they asking all of these questions? Remember, part of their role is to verify it, because you should be able to tell your story in addition to writing your story. So sometimes those verification questions in those interviews is truly getting you to restate what you've already said in the report. And it's not that they haven't read that report. They're really trying to verify that what you say is actually happening is indeed what's actually happening. And so that's the purpose of your on-site team. They begin their preparation long before they get there. As I mentioned before, your self-study report is provided to them 6 weeks in advance of the visit. And we expect our peers to have read that report, to come up with questions. Oftentimes, the team chair is reaching out to the nurse administrator, already giving some, for lack of a better way to say it, some heads up about some additional information that's going to be needed so that you have plenty of time to get that ready and prepared for your peers. As I mentioned, a visit is typically 3 days, and the 3 days is 2 full days, plus the exit meeting day, which is the final day. Your peers will, most visits are Tuesday through
Look
Thursday.
how sweaty I am. It's so hot.
So
Hey, get out of there.
Somebody be muted, please.
Yeah, somebody has their mic open, so you might want to mute your phone. So most of the time it's a 3-day visit. Your peers will arrive on Monday. They'll visit all day Tuesday, all day Wednesday. They'll do their exit meeting on Thursday morning, and then they'll leave. That being said, sometimes we have complex visits that have multiple campuses. And especially for my initials, we have to visit all of your locations for an initial visit. For continuing, we need to visit a representative sample. And so some of our programs have campuses that are 100 and 200 miles away. Well, that can add to the actual length of the visit. Some of our international programs, because of language differences, can also add to the visit. But typically it's a 3-day visit. We do consider distance education and different delivery modalities. Some things to think about from your perspective as you get ready for an accreditation visit. Non-COVID, you are responsible for making hotel arrangements. And so be thinking about, okay, what's the hotel that I would want one of my loved ones to stay in that is easy access for us. Many times your peers are meeting each other for the first time at the airport, so you don't want to have to bunk with someone you've never met before. So we do require that they have separate rooms. And then we do request that the rooms are in close proximity. So when you're making your hotel reservations, a lot of times you will request that the rooms be close to each other or on the same floor, because oftentimes when they finish at your program for the day, they're working into the night on their site visit report, and sometimes they're going back and forth between the various rooms. With regards to restaurants, It helps if the hotel provides breakfast and or has a restaurant within a reasonable walking distance. And then in the evening, the site visitors are actually taking care of themselves for dinner as well. What always comes into question is, what do we do about lunch? Because lunch oftentimes is on campus. And I'm going to be honest with you. We have a mixture of things that happen at lunch. There are some programs who provide lunch for their peers, and they're able to do so, and the nurse administrator just puts that into their accreditation budget, and so they may order in salads or sandwiches or something inexpensive, and they provide it in the evidence room. Other programs are not allowed to provide the meal for their peers, and that's perfectly okay. So they'll take them to the college cafeteria. The peers will go through the cafeteria line, purchase their own lunch, and then they'll take it back to the evidence room and eat it there. And then there are those cases where the program provides menus and says, well, we're going to order in, pick from the menu, and then they'll each person will pay for their own meal. So it can vary as to how you do it. As part of the accreditation fee, you are paying a per diem per person, so their meals are technically reimbursed to them or part of their per diem, and so you don't have to provide their meals. That being said, when a hotel doesn't have a restaurant within a reasonable walking distance, remember that your peers are on foot, and so they may have to order in. But then again, we do have programs that are very rural, and sometimes the program will, take them by a drive-through on the way back to the hotel so that they actually have something to eat for dinner. Travel, the program is responsible for making arrangements for the pickup for all of your site visitors from the airport. You are responsible for their transportation to and from the hotel to the college, as well as back to the airport. Now, that can be arranging a car service that picks them up. It could be arranging for your transportation within the college. I mean, I've had maintenance men and security guards pick me up in the college van. I've had faculty who are eligible to drive a college vehicle pick me up. I've had nurse administrators pick me up, and then I've also had car services. So again, you are responsible for their travel. Please note that the team chair works with the team to coordinate their travel so that ideally the site visitors arrive within 1 or 2 hours of each other. So if I'm the first person to arrive, you don't have to run pick me up and then go back and pick up the next one and the third one. We coordinate it so that we all arrive within a reasonable time frame of each other, and we wait until the last person gets there, and then we can go to the college or to the hotel. And so that will be part of the logistics that you'll have to think through. And then technology. I would say that about 90% of our peer evaluators actually bring their own personal laptops. But there are a few who will request that a laptop be made available to them. Minimally, in the resource room, there needs to be a computer that is connected to a printer so that the team is able to put their report together prior to the exit meeting and actually have a printout of that report to be prepared for that exit meeting. And so team chairs will work with our nurse administrators to help the college know what technology is needed for the team, if any. One of the big things anymore may be having your IT folks available to help your peers actually access the internet while on campus, because even some of your resources that you're pointing them to require them to get on the internet to do so. And anymore, some of those firewalls at colleges won't allow me as a visitor to get on without having some special access. And so again, it's important to work with IT on that. Again, what you will see on the ACEN website is we meet with a lot of different groups. One of the meetings would be with administration. Note that administration can be the president or the chief executive officer. It doesn't have to be. So sometimes we get these panic calls, well, you know, President Smith is not going to be here. We need to change our accreditation visit. And it's like, well, yeah, maybe. You know, as long as President Smith is okay with Vice President Brown and Dean Green representing the college, then that's okay. We just have to meet with administration. Another group that we meet with will be faculty. We'll meet with students. Students will be separate and apart from faculty or any administrators. Your peers will also need to meet with student service representatives, such as financial aid, the registrar, IT support, librarians, some of those folks that provide various services for them. Again, for those of you coming through reaccreditation visits, we no longer are meeting with general education faculty, because oftentimes the information that was gleaned from that particular meeting can be achieved in other interviews. Some of the other things that we do have to do, and I'll talk about it here in a minute, we have to have a public meeting, and that's part of the U.S. Department of Ed's requirements, that any accreditation visit has the opportunity for the public to make third-party comments. And so in a few minutes, we're going to talk more about that. Part of the visit is looking at your resources. Now, one of the things that is transitioning at the ACEN, effective this fall, is that our programs are starting to provide non-confidential virtual supporting evidence with the self-study report. And so basically what I mean by that is that you will be providing your evidence room non-confidential information on the same flash drive that you are submitting your self-study report to your peers. This allows them access to your supporting evidence long before they actually arrive on site. And so your document room is now going to be virtual, and all of your evidence is going to be put on a flash drive. Eventually, the ACEN is working on a portal where you will actually be uploading that non-confidential information. So your peers will be getting the evidence to support things sooner, and only would they be reviewing the confidential document during the actual visit itself. What are some examples of confidential documents? Number one, faculty files. 9 times out of 10, we're needing to look at transcripts and things like that, which are considered confidential. And so faculty files, student files, in some cases, budgets are considered confidential. And so anything that you as a program see as a confidential document, we will need to make sure that when the agenda is built, that there's time in order to be able to review those resources or those confidential documents. As far as alternative delivery modalities, if you are teaching any online courses or any hybrid courses, then your peers need to have access to those courses. So part of your preparation will be, again, working with IT in order to provide them access to your learning management system. Ideally, this occurs 6 weeks in advance when they get their self-study report, and it concludes approximately 1 week after the visit, because 1 week after the visit's when their site visit report due. And so it gives them that little bit of wiggle room. Again, part of the components of the visit is looking at any other documents. Sometimes what you send on a flash drive won't be everything they need to look at, and so they may be asking for additional information on site. Again, looking at your program evaluation and assessment of outcomes, looking at your SPE. Your SPE has probably the data in it, should have data in it, but sometimes your raw data is actually on site, and so they're going to be looking at that. The other component is that team analysis of the findings. your team needs to have time to just sit and think and to talk to each other and to prepare. What you'll find, nurse administrators, is that your team will be meeting with you on a daily basis, keeping you appraised of what's going on, what they're finding, what their challenges are, so that we provide you every opportunity in order to provide additional information. And then there's the exit meeting itself. The exit meeting, number one, there is a personal exit meeting with the nurse administrator so that your peers will sit down one-on-one with you and provide information about what their findings are. Findings have to do with your compliance with the standards. It has to do with any potential strengths that your peers have identified, and the findings can also be areas needing development. Typically, the exit meeting with the nurse administrator will take approximately an hour because your peers will be providing you with specific information. The public exit meeting is whereby you as a program can invite whoever you want to attend this exit meeting. I've been to exit meetings that have had just the nurse administrator and perhaps 2 other people. I've been to exit meetings where there was over 100 people in attendance, including some students. You determine who comes to the exit meeting. Please note that the purpose of the exit meeting is for your peers to provide their preliminary findings regarding the program's compliance with the standards and criteria and their preliminary recommendation. And it is only a recommendation. It is not the final decision. The reason I emphasize the word preliminary is 2 days is a fast and furious time frame. And as they're refining their report, it is possible that as a team, they may really dig into something else and find some additional information that would take an area needing development off the table because they finally found what they needed. Or you may have provided to them as they were walking out the door, here's this one more piece of information, and that was what they needed. And so it is a preliminary finding at the exit meeting, and there can be changes during the process. A lot of times there's not, but there can be between when they leave and when you get to see the report itself. Nurse administrators, you are a big part of planning this. It doesn't mean that you can't have your faculty help you do that, but one of the big things is looking at the agenda. What you will find on the ACEN website, we have some agenda templates that you can use in order to start that planning process. Please note that on the agenda, you can take and move the different kinds of meetings to different days and or different times, but please pay close attention to the time frame. So if, for example, if the faculty meeting's 2 hours, you can move it wherever it's going to work best, but it still needs to be that 2 hours. And typically a faculty meeting does occur on the first day because your faculty meeting is where a lot of information is gathered, and it gives your peers that second day, if there's additional information needing, to actually get that. Part of the meeting is also nurse administrators determining, when some of the key players on campus are available and scheduling around them if need be. We do go visit off-campus instructional sites. Sometimes this requires a divide and conquer approach, whereby some of the team may be on campus doing some of these interviews while one of the visitors is out touring your off-campus instructional sites. As I mentioned before, if there are confidential documents, those need to be reviewed on site. The public meeting. As I mentioned, you are required to have a public meeting. That public meeting also has to be publicized so that people can actually come. And then there's the exit meeting that's part of the agenda, and then the daily meetings between the nurse administrator and minimally the team chair to keep our NAs apprised of what's going on. So nurse administrators, you need to start planning early, because even as you're putting in the information form requesting the visit, part of that form requires you to know what's happening on the college campus so that you can provide the ACN with information to say, hey, that's not a good week to come because that's our fall break, or that's our spring break, or we're having a huge convocation, and so those are weeks that we need to avoid. It's also important, again, to think about who you're going to invite to the various interviews, and then once you have received the actual week of the visit, the dates of the visit, that you distribute that information to all the potential interviewees so that they can block their calendars as you're refining that agenda in order to know where they're going to be. Having worked on a college campus for 20 some odd years, just getting a meeting room can be challenging. And so the sooner you know when your visit is and blocking those rooms so that you can have those for the various meetings, the more important it is. And again, as I mentioned, looking at that campus calendar to make sure that you know when the holidays are to avoid those. How do we pick who comes to see you? Well, number one, as I mentioned before, it is based upon their knowledge and experience, because you want peer evaluators. You want individuals to understand. Now, is it a perfect world where everybody on a team is from an associate degree program from a college of a similar size that does or does not use distance education? It's not a perfect world, but we do want individuals who are coming to the program that understand associate degree education in a community college setting. We want someone, if you're using a lot of distance education, to have that distance education expertise to be able to evaluate you effectively from that perspective. We do, again, try to match governing organization and program characteristics because most of you are coming from community colleges, but you can imagine that if you're at a religious institution, it helps for someone to understand more about religious institutions than a state college system. And then we do consider the team's travel and the location in proximity to their own state. Please note that no one from the state of California would ever come visit a program in California. That's an automatic conflict of interest. And so saying that, you may want to look around in California, because we do have several California ACN site visitors. Those are resources to you that you could reach out. Oftentimes they may be willing to read your self-study report. Some of them may be willing to come and do a mock site visit for you. So use those resources in order to prepare for your actual visit. Again, our site visit teams are a minimum of 3 people. A lot does depend upon the diversity and complexity of the program, how many sites are going to be visited, the size of the program, the number of faculty and students, as well as distance education. So for those of you who have both a practical and an associate degree program that might be visited simultaneously, a minimum team would be 4 people. And then we consider the complexities of both programs to determine whether or not additional folks need to be added to the team, so that within the 2 days, the 3 days of the actual visit, everything can get done without running from 6 in the morning until midnight. With that, please note, nurse administrators, that should you have 2 separately accredited ACN programs that are on different cycles, you can request them to be moved to the same cycle, but you have to request it. So if perhaps you have your associate degree program currently accredited and you're wanting to add your practical program, we can marry them up so that they can be on the same cycle. That can save you the angst of having to write 2 separate self-study reports. It actually can also save you some money as far as the accreditation visit itself is concerned, because if we had 2 separate visits, that's 6 site visitors. If we're able to combine them, it's a minimum of 4. So you're potentially saving the per diem for 2 extra people. Know that if you're asking them to be matched up, you do have to formally request that. Dr. Stoll, our CEO, She's never going to say no. That being said, just to kind of remind folks, an initial accreditation visit is only for 5 years, whereas a continuing accreditation would be for 8 years. And so you may not want to match up the visits with an initial and a continuing, because then they're automatically off cycle with the very next visit. But again, that's something that the directors can work with you on to kind of help plan when it's going to make sense to try to match them up. I've already mentioned the public meetings and how important it is, and that it is a requirement of the U.S. Department of Ed for us to actually have a public meeting. A public meeting is where individuals outside of the college, outside of the nursing program, are invited to make comments regarding the actual nursing program. You need to announce this, but you don't have to pay a lot of money for it. You can obviously put it in the newspaper or on the radio, but you can also put it on the nursing program website as well as the college website. But one of the things two things that your peers have found very helpful is oftentimes your clinical hospital will allow you to post flyers and or posters. And as long as you've created those flyers, they allow you to post it strategically throughout the facility, so that not only some of the employees can see those signs, but perhaps the patients and or their families. And then you certainly can do email blasts to your graduates, to your advisory committee, to your clinical contacts, so that the word gets out. Part of the third-party comment is for individuals, A, to attend the public meeting in person, but B, you also have to provide them the opportunity to provide written comments. Written comments have to be sent directly to the ACEN office. You cannot accept those as a program and then to be considered written comments. They need to come to the ACEN office. Once we receive them, we vet them as to what they are, and then that information is shared with our team chairs, who in turn will share it with you during the actual accreditation visit. But the public comments, our third-party comments, needs to be announced 6 weeks prior to the visit. It does need to include the written comments and where those written comments need to be sent. And it's important, nurse administrators, that you keep up with all the different ways that you've announced this, because this becomes part of your evidence that you did indeed publicize the public meeting. You will find on the ACEN website guidelines for announcing the public meeting, and you can, in soliciting third-party comments, you can take that template, drop the information pertinent to your program in, and use that as your actual communication to potential communities of interest to announce the third parties. Again, documents. Non-confidential documents at this point are being placed on a flash drive. So as you're writing your self-study report, what I would suggest to each of you is go ahead and think about, if I've had to pull document X as part of writing it, think about, as a faculty, where do you want to keep all of these documents? Many of our programs may have a shared drive or an intranet that they're able to create folders on. They perhaps may develop an LMS course specific to ACEN, and you use the LMS to be the repository for your various documents. My suggestion to you relative to documents: keep them organized. With your documents, a suggestion would be have a folder for standard 1, a folder for standard 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, and so forth. Within that folder for standard 1, you may have subfolders specific to each criterion. What is also going to be key on your documents, especially now that they're going to be electronic, is that they are clearly labeled, so that no two documents have the same title. They're perhaps labeled as a table or labeled as Exhibit 1.1A versus 1.1B, something of that nature, so that it's very clear. And then as you're writing the report, when you refer to that supporting evidence, you're using the same terminology to help match it up in your document repository. But the flash drive will have two primary folders. The first folder will be your self-study report and the required appendices, as well as any optional appendices. The second folder will be your supporting documents, and within that second folder, as I indicated, having a folder for Standard 1, Standard 2, etc. Your organization can be your best friend. It can also be your worst enemy. I'll just use an example. My very, very first accreditation visit, we only had 2 individuals on the visit, and I kid you not, the 2 of us walked into an evidence room that literally had boxes that were just piled. There was no organization to that room whatsoever. It was just, okay, here it is, look through it, do what you want to do. And that was the most challenging visit I have ever been on, because I wanted to help this program, but you're just overwhelmed with the amount of information, and because none of it was organized, it made it very, very challenging. So organization can be your best friend, and it helps you through this process. So, that may be a role that one of your faculty takes on, because perhaps he or she is the best organizer there is, and they work to make sure that everything is clearly labeled and ready to go, and then they perhaps make sure in the self-study report that the way it's labeled in that supporting evidence is the way it's referenced in the self-study report. Again, as I've already mentioned, confidential documents will be reviewed on site. So please don't feel like you need to put something on that flash drive that you feel is confidential. Just let the team chair know that the following documents are going to be available on site. So no longer are referring to it as an evidence room, because in essence, most of your evidence will be sent in advance, but your team will need a resource workroom while they're on campus, and it needs to be a room that's large enough to accommodate the entire team at the same time, because there will be times where they're all there. We do suggest that you have some basic office supplies, paper clips and pens, perhaps a notepad. And then, as I mentioned previously, you do need to make sure that there's at least a computer that has internet access and has access to a printer. And then any materials that are in the resource room, for example, some programs will be putting their student examples, the student work in there, because again, your college may consider that confidential. Any materials that are in the actual resource room, you would want to make sure that they too have been organized appropriately. Again, as I mentioned with the exit meeting, we do meet with the nurse administrator privately, but in the public exit meeting, you determine who is invited. You determine from that perspective. Please note, again, for those of you who are coming through reaccreditation visits, your last exit meeting may have lasted 45 minutes to an hour. Currently, the exit meetings are lasting 15 to 20 minutes, because at the public exit meeting, what will be presented is compliance versus non-compliance, strengths that have been identified, or areas needing development that have been identified for each of the standards. At the public exit meeting, there is no explanations or justifications. That occurs with the nurse administrator in the one-on-one meeting. And again, the site visit team will be making a accreditation recommendation. That recommendation will be sent to the Board of Commissioners as well as to the evaluation review panel. The site visit team has a limited number of recommendations they can make. For those of you seeking initial accreditation, your peers only have 2 options. That is to grant initial accreditation because you've demonstrated compliance with all accreditation standards. So all 6 standards are in compliance. You can still have areas needing development because no program is perfect. So you may have areas needing development, but you essentially have to be compliant with all 6 standards. If you are non-compliant with one standard, Their only recourse is to deny initial accreditation. For those with continuing accreditation, they have a few more options. The first would be continuing accreditation because the program's in compliance with all standards. In the office, we like to call this a C8, which is see you in 8 years because you're good to go. And so that's the first potential recommendation. Your peers can also make a recommendation to continue your accreditation with conditions. Conditions is when the program is in non-compliance with one or two of the 6 accreditation standards. And so your peers would recommend continuing with conditions. Your peers can also recommend continuing with warning. Warning means that the program is in non-compliance with 3 or more accreditation standards. So you've got a 50 on the test, so to speak. And then there is the possibility that your peers can and would have to recommend a denial of a continuing accreditation. And that would be typically when you're having some type of follow-up visit where you had gone into that visit already on conditions or gone into that visit already on warning. But they could recommend a denial. Once the site visit is over, your peers will continue refining their report. They have up to 1 week to get the report finalized and sent into the ACEN office. And then at the office, we have some English majors that help us with formatting the report and looking at it for grammar. Once our editing team finishes with it, it comes to one of the professional staff members. We review the report for content to verify that the teams have evidence for each of the criterion and standards that is necessary. And if there's something lacking, then we'll ask the team, or if from our perspective something is not clear in their report, we ask clarification so that we get all of that information clarified. For nurse administrators, you have the opportunity, you will receive a draft of the report to review for errors of fact, whereby perhaps your peers misspelled something, may have gotten the actual process slightly incorrect, and so you have the opportunity to address errors of fact. Nurse administrators, this draft of the report is sent to you as an email attachment, and it is sent within 8 weeks of the visit. So please don't ask a week after the visit, where's the draft? Well, it's still at the editing phase. And so within 8 weeks of the visit, it will come to you as a draft for you to report errors of fact. And you fill out what we call the Nurse Administrator Response Form, affectionately known as the NARF. And once the NARF is back, the professional staff look at that, and if they're true errors of fact, we can get the report finalized and back to you. If we need to ask the peers to verify that, then they will look at that and provide input into the errors of fact. Once the report is finalized, you will receive a copy of the final report. That report is finalized before, and the peer evaluators get a copy of the final report. All of that is finalized before the evaluation review panel. But the site visit report, as well as your self-study report, is part of the evidence that the evaluation review panel reviews. It's also part of the evidence that the Board of Commissioners uses for their final decision. As it goes through the process, which we're going to finish up here in a minute, talking about the next 2 steps of the process, you will receive a decision letter within 30 days of the Board of Commissioners' decision. I don't think anybody on the phone, or excuse me, in the webinar, are having any fall 2020 visits or spring 21. And unfortunately with COVID, we don't know what may happen with fall of 21 visits. But we do have a whole separate web link out there specific to virtual visits. So if perhaps any of you are having an upcoming focus visit, everything is being done virtually. So if you're interested in how the ACN is going to do all these visits, you can find that information on our website. If the virtual visits continue, secondary to the COVID situation, these resources will still be available to you as well. The third step of the evaluation process is our evaluation review panel. Our ERP is also composed of peer evaluators. And ERP, we have panels specific to associate degree programs. We have a panel that's a combination of associate and diploma programs. We have panels that are specific to practical. We have a combined associate practical panel. We have a combined baccalaureate, master's, and clinical doctorate panel. And then we also have a panel that is composed of anything from the clinical doctorate all the way down to the practical level. We basically build our panels based upon the programs and the program types that are in a given cycle. Historically, an ERP session is composed of 9 separate panels reviewing different kinds of programs. Again, the ERP is composed of your peers. These are our seasoned peer evaluators. They all have had a minimum of 3 visits before they can be considered for ERP. They will make their own independent professional judgment about your program's compliance with standards and criteria. What they have available to them is your self-study report as well as the site visit report. Also, if things have changed between the time of the site visit, programs are allowed to provide updated information for the ERP panel to consider. A good example of that is if your visit occurs in September and your 2020 licensure pass rates are not finalized, but they get finalized before ERP meets at the end of January, and it's the difference in compliance and non-compliance, you definitely want to provide ERP with the latest and greatest information. And so they can consider new information that has occurred since the time of the accreditation visit, but that's for selected criteria. Again, they will be looking at your self-study report, so they don't have the benefit of being on the ground and having their eyes and ears on the ground. That's your site visit team. So that's why, again, your self-study report needs to be very clear so that a pair of outside eyes can truly understand your story. They will have access to the site visitor's report and that nurse administrator response form for errors of fact. They also have access to that. Each of our evaluation review panels is chaired by one of our commissioners. The commissioner is truly there to run the panel. He or she does not have a vote on the panel, but they're also taking notes so that if a program has some challenging circumstances, they're taking notes of how that peer panel reviewed that program, and they have those notes to take with them to the Board of Commissioners. And so for the board to have information about how perhaps the panel really struggled with making this decision and how perhaps there were multiple votes taken and those type of things. What happens at ERP is panels are composed of anywhere from as few as 8 people through as many as 16 people. Again, it depends upon how many total programs are being reviewed. ERP panelists do not know the other panel members until they actually show up at ERP. And so if an ERP panelist is assigned to review your program, no one knows who the other 1 or 2 reviewers are for that program. So these individuals are truly reviewing your program's compliance with the standards and criteria, independent of any other peer reviewers. They each prepare a report that they will present. The chair will call upon the first reviewer to provide his or her report. The second reviewer is allowed to add to that report, and then if there is a third reviewer, he or she adds to the report as well. Then they will call upon the first reviewer to make a recommendation. That recommendation is seconded, and then it is voted on by the entire panel. As a program, you are allowed to participate as part of the evaluation review panel process. Participation means one of two things. One or two individuals, typically the nurse administrator and one other person, can come to Atlanta for ERP and sit in the room as the peers are truly evaluating the program. And you're listening to the process. You're not allowed to provide additional information. The nurse administrator is able at the end to speak to the process and how he or she found the process, but you're not allowed to provide any additional information. The second way that you can participate in ERP is by conference call. And if you participate by conference call, you can have as many folks in the room listening to the process as you want to. An ERP review of a program takes typically 20, no more than 30 minutes. And so, again, use that information to base a decision on whether or not you want to come to Atlanta, to sit in the room, to listen to your colleagues deliberate your program, versus listening on the phone and everybody being able to listen, all the faculty. I frequently have questions, does it make a difference if I'm in the room versus on the phone? It truly doesn't. And the process happens the same way, regardless if you're in the room or not. And so save some money and stay at home. And what's also, I think, more important, not just saving the money and staying at home, but it's so that everybody on campus can listen to how your program's being reviewed. Again, the evaluation review panel make recommendations. When does ERP meet? For a fall visit, ERP meets at the end of January, the first week of February. I mean, it varies, but typically it's being January. For a spring meeting, it occurs typically the first week of June. What will happen, nurse administrators, is once the agenda has been developed for ERP, you will be notified which specific day your program has been scheduled for, as well as the approximate time. Because you are on the West Coast, a lot of times from an East Coast perspective, we're reviewing your programs in the afternoon, which means that you're being reviewed at West Coast time in the morning. Because we typically do panels from 8 in the morning until 5 in the evening. And so most of our West Coast folks are in the afternoon for East Coast time, so that you're in the morning. At ERP, your peers basically have the same potential that your site visit team did as far as their recommendation. ERPs can recommend granting initial accreditation or denying. That's their only two options. They have the same 4 potential recommendations that the site visit team did. That's continuing, which is see you in 8 years, versus continuing with conditions, you're in non-compliance with 1 or 2 accreditation standards, versus continuing with warning, you're in non-compliance with 3 or more accreditation standards, or denying your continuing accreditation because you went into the visit on conditions and or warning. Again, ERP is only a recommendation. The ERP recommendation may be the same as the site visit team. It can be different because everybody's doing this independent analysis and they may come to a different conclusion. You may have additional information that allows them to come to a different conclusion. So it is a process. The last and final step of the peer evaluation is our Board of Commissioners. They are the ones who will make the final decision. They, too, make their own independent professional judgment about your program's compliance with standards and criteria, and their purpose is to ensure that there's consistent application of the standards across all programs. Think about it. On a site visit, we may have 30 different programs being reviewed in a given week. That's 30 separate teams. That, there's about 300 people making site visits on any given cycle. At the ERP, you're looking associate to associate, so there's consistent decisions among associate degree programs, but our Board of Commissioners are making sure that there are consistent decisions from the practical programs as well as the clinical doctorate. There are actually 17 board members. There are 11 commissioners that are nurse educators. from ACEN Accredited program. There are 3 commissioners that represent the public that have nothing to do with nursing. And then there are 3 commissioners that represent nursing service or your clinicians. All of your commissioners are elected. Nurse administrators, you serve as the vote for your program. We have a new set of Board of Commissioners that will be coming in October 1, as well as some returning Board of Commissioners. The next round of voting will occur in April for the next set of Board of Commissioners. The Board of Commissioners have a little bit more of a decision-making body. From an initial accreditation visit, they still only have the 2 options. One is to grant initial because the program is in compliance with all 6 accreditation standards. The other is to deny because the program is in non-compliance with at least 1 standard. If initial accreditation is granted, it is for 5 years and for 5 years only. And so we'll be back doing our first reaccreditation visit in 5 years. With a continuing accreditation visit, your commissioners have the same 4 potential options, but then they also have some other decisions to make as well as a 5th option. Continuing for 8 years is continuing for 8 years. Continuing with conditions, the program is in non-compliance with 1 or 2 accreditation standards. The commissioners then have to also make the decision when a follow-up report, which is a written report specific to the standards of non-compliance, would be due. They can continue with conditions with a follow-up report in 1 year versus 2 years. And then for our practical programs, it's typically 18 months. Same principle with continuing with warning. You're in non-compliance with 3 accreditation standards. The board can say, we want the follow-up report in 1 year versus 2 years for our degree programs, or for our LPN programs, it's 18 months. The Board of Commissioners has an extra decision that they can make, which is called continuing with warning for good cause. Warning for good cause is when a program goes into the review process either on conditions or already on warning. And perhaps it's 1 year, perhaps it's 2 years, but let's just say they were having a licensure pass rate issue, and maybe initially they were in non-compliance with Standard 4 as well. They had curriculum issues, which resulted in poor outcomes. And let's say they've gotten the curriculum cleaned up, but as we all know, it takes a little bit of time for that to have a positive impact on the outcomes. So good cause can be provided by the Board of Commissioners because the program has made significant progress, but they're not quite there. One way to think about this is that if you're familiar with football, with conditions you were on the 10-yard line, and now you've moved it all the way to the far end of the field and you made the 10-yard line on that side, but you haven't quite made that touchdown because there just hasn't been enough time. But you've made so much progress on that field. There's so many positive things that are happening. You just need a little more time. The board can give you warning with good cause and then give you an additional 1 to 2 years of accreditation or 18 months for our practical program to make that touchdown. It's only when you've gone through the maximum monitoring time by the Department of Ed that the board has to make a very challenging and difficult decision, which is to truly deny continuing accreditation. So with the process, unless something was totally egregious going on, we do have due process where programs are given the opportunity to correct what's going on and get things right before they would truly totally lose their accreditation. Again, with regards to the commissioners' meeting, they meet in March for our fall visit and September for our spring visit. So let's kind of think about the process. Between the time you have a visit in September or October, it then goes to the to the evaluation review panel in January, and it then finally goes to the Board of Commissioners in March. That's almost 6 months. That's why along that trajectory, if additional information is available, you are allowed as a program to provide the board with the latest and greatest information upon which to make that final board decision. And once the board has made their decision, within 30 days, you do receive a formal letter from the board regarding that formal decision. Again, what are your resources at the ACEN? Number one, the professional staff, the directors. We are there to help you. We want to help you. Don't hesitate to reach out to ask questions. Send us emails with questions. There's a general portal on the website that you can send just general questions to. A lot of those are forwarded to professional staff. We have to answer those. I'm going to give you my contact information here in just a few minutes. I feel fine to just email me directly. One of the other things I want to encourage our currently accredited programs to do, as well as the hopefully soon to be accredited programs, think about being a peer evaluator. I think Riverside's on this. We've had your previous director is one of our peer evaluators. She also serves on ERP. The best way to truly understand the ACEN process is to become a peer evaluator, because you will constantly be engaged in the process. And I can honestly say, since 2004, when I started as a peer, every site visit I went on, I learned something that I could take, that nugget that I could take back to my own program and use, either to benefit my program, but sometimes I also saw things that, I don't really want to go there. So there's those things. Again, our website. We are in the process of refining our website, but there's a lot of resources out there. There's guidelines, there's templates, there's policies. If you haven't taken the time to look at the ACEN website, please do so, because you'll find that there's a lot of resources for you. The directors are currently, because of COVID, all of our self-study forums have been canceled for the fall, and we hope we might be able to have one in the spring, but that's yet to be determined. So we are in the process of developing e-courses, and in early October to mid-October, one of the e-courses will be understanding and applying the ACEN standards and criteria. That basically is a replacement for the self-study forms. Different than the self-study forms from the perspective that we're really going into more details about truly understanding the different standards and the respective criteria, but it's also about how to write a report for the ACEN. And then we're also developing an e-course for what used to be our program administrator workshop, and that is going to be an e-course that you can also sign up for. There also are already on our ACEN website some webinars that are totally free. There is a webinar there that we did with Neppen and Odin about the candidacy process that you're welcome to go look at and review. There is also a free webinar on our peer evaluator training that our peers have to go through that can also review you on the ACEN standards and criteria. I've already spoken to you about advisory reviews. Again, those would be most likely utilized by those programs seeking continuing accreditation, because you get a lot of that during the candidacy process. So there's that aspect. We also have a new, relatively new service, which is called a site visitor observer. An observer is the opportunity for an individual to be embedded into a site visit team. He or she is not part of the team, but they are truly observing the process from the inside. There is an application process where you have to apply for it, but any of our programs that are candidates coming up with an initial visit are eligible. Any of our continuing are eligible. Observers are required to go through the ACEN peer evaluator training. They are required to sign confidentiality forms. Our programs have to agree to having an observer. So for some of our continuing programs, if you're willing for the team to have somebody just learning about the process, as part of it. It doesn't cost you anything from that perspective as a host program, other than the fact you've got this extra person tagging along. With the site visit observer, the cost is to the program who is sending the observer. The observer is responsible for his or her travel as well as meals and that type of thing. But they receive a copy of the self-study report. They get to sit in on team deliberations. They get to look at the evidence room. They get to sit in on interviews. And so you really get a perspective of what it is for the inside. So look at the site visit observer opportunity. And then again, for those of you coming through candidacy, we have an intensive mentoring process through candidacy. In the office, they call me the mama bear because all of my candidate programs are my little cubs, and I want to make sure that my cubs are going to be safe and they're going to get through the process.